he was the first man, first person who looked at the people in the network, not the machines. Up until then, it had been gigahertz and megabytes, but suddenly somebody started talking about how people used the network to enrich their lives. So, I hope you all enjoy Howard as much today as I did back in '92. Howard Rheingold, please come on.
Thank you, Thomas. And thank you, Thomas and Jill, for your hospitality. I got a little tour of Bergen yesterday, which was wonderful. And I usually just launch into my story, but whenever I hear that I'm speaking to librarians, I take an opportunity to make a personal address. It's a little bit corny, but very sincere. I was one of those people who had a lot of trouble in school when I was young. I particularly had a lot of trouble with the boring things they were trying to teach me, and with being told I had to sit still all day, and teachers really didn't know what to do with me. I probably would have ended up in a lot more trouble than I did, except some smart teachers sent me to the library, and the librarians there really opened a world to me that was not visible as a young man in Phoenix, Arizona, and I probably would be in a prison somewhere today instead of standing here speaking to you, except for Mrs. Wilhite at Madison School No. 2 in Phoenix, Arizona. So thank you, Mrs. Wilhite, and thank you, librarians. And those of you who deal with young people probably don't have any idea of how much impact you sometimes have. I started on the line of thinking that led me to write the book and brought me here today. Actually, quite a while ago, about 4.5 years ago, I was in Tokyo giving a talk about the social aspects of the internet, the kind of internet that we're used to on our desktops or our laptops. And I noticed something very strange. It was strange to Americanize in the spring of 2000. Certainly wouldn't have been strange to anyone in Scandinavia, and it certainly wasn't in Japan. And that was the simple sight of about 1 in every 5 people walking down the street looking at their telephones. This was something that in 2000 was not a customary sight in the United States. And of course people were thumbing what I later learned to be messages, SMS messages on their telephone. There are a lot of unusual sights in Tokyo for American eyes, so I didn't really look into it any more than that. But I happened to find myself not too many weeks later in Helsinki. Very different culture, another side of the world, sitting at an outdoor cafe, having a cup of coffee, when 3 teenagers walked by and encountered 2 older adults right next to where I was sitting, and started having a conversation. Conversation in Finnish, so I have no idea what they were saying, but I couldn't help notice that, like most Finns, they were carrying their telephones in their hands and looking at their phones fairly often. And I noticed that one of the young people looked at his phone and smiled, and showed the screen of his telephone to his 2 peers, and they both smiled. But he didn't show it to the older adults that they were speaking to, and they carried on this conversation as if that was normal. And that struck me as something worth looking into. What was going on with people and looking at their telephones, and particularly with the young people. So I started asking around, and the first interesting note that piqued my curiosity and motivated me to start looking into this a little bit deeper was that my friends in Finland and my friends in Japan used the same terms when they described what the young people were doing. They said they were flocking. They all flocked like birds and showed up at the same mall or the same fast food restaurant at the same time from 8 different directions because they had been exchanging these messages. That was interesting. Not enough to go research a book, but it prepared me for when I read the newspaper. Something happened in the Philippines that really aroused my interest. Joseph Estrada was the president of the Philippines at the time, had been accused of corruption, and there were hearings in the Philippine Congress. Most of the people in the Philippines were watching this on television. It was a big media event as well as a political event. And as it happened, the hearings were suddenly shut down by some senators associated with the Estrada regime. What happened then was interesting. Within minutes, tens of thousands of people, almost all of them wearing black, started showing up in the square. There's a square in Manila called EDSA, Epifania de los Santos, where the people power demonstrations against the Marcos regime had happened 10 years previously. Within a couple of days, actually, millions of people showed up in that square, almost all of them wearing black, and exchanging text messages. Millions of text messages, not just go to EDSA, wear black, but political opinions and rumors. In fact, there's a famous manifesto, you can imagine a manifesto written in 160 characters, called Generation Text. We are Generation Text. There's a feeling among the people who did not have other means of access to the media that being able to use their telephones and texting to organize this demonstration gave them a feeling of empowerment. And in fact, the Estrada regime fell. Now, I hasten to add that I'm not making a comment on whether that was better or worse for the Philippine people. I'm not really an expert on Philippine politics. But clearly, something new was happening there in terms of spontaneous political organizing. And I felt that there was a connection between the teenagers in different parts of the world, socially organizing, and these millions of Philippine citizens organizing political protests. So I started asking around and found some sociologist friends who introduced me to the idea of collective action. And I think that the connection between those events is that having access to mobile communications, and particularly text communications that you can forward widely, lowered a threshold for collective action, enabled people to organize their activities in the face-to-face world in a way that they had not before. And I'm going to get back to that because I think that that's an important overriding theme beyond the bits and bytes of the technology. But I also understood that the devices that people are carrying that we are accustomed to thinking of and calling telephones really are becoming less and less like the fixed telephone technology that we have been accustomed to for most of a century. And that what's happening is that the devices we use to make telephone calls and to send messages are increasingly little internet terminals, that in fact several technologies are merging, and we're carrying that merger with us. The mobile telephone, the personal computer, and the internet I believe, are combining into a new technology that's the basis of a new medium for communications. And that gave me some handles on thinking about what's happening. And I think as we look at what happens in the next 5 or 10 years, some of the things that we've learned from the last 10 or 20 years can give us some lenses to look at what's happening. If you look back at the PC and the internet revolutions, some of the characteristics there, I think, can give us some clues. Well, first, sometimes, but not always, when different technologies combine to form a new medium, that new medium has unique characteristics that are not easily predictable from the components. So when the microchip and the television screen made the PC possible, what we got were not the old mainframe computers that we use for scientific calculations and data processing for businesses. What we got were PCs that people used to do things that computers had not been used to do before. And people who had not used computers before began to use these devices. And as the price dropped, it became something of an appliance that people who were not engineers or programmers began to use. In fact, when the price of the PC over a few years dropped to around the average monthly salary of the lower end of the middle class, which is about, US terms, about $2,000 a month, maybe I guess 1,500 euros a month, that's when it really began to take off. And you can calculate on the basis of just where the hardware is going and the cost and the price of the devices are going, that a device that people will carry will enable them to make voice phone calls and have access to data communications will reach about the average monthly salary of the world, which is about $60 or $70 per month in about 7 years. So I think that what we are seeing now is going to be much more widespread than the PC or the internet was, because more people are going to have this technology with them in their pockets, in their hands, than previous technologies. 600 million mobile phones sold worldwide this year, about roughly 10% of the world's population. Number of mobile phones in the world is equivalent to about a quarter of the world's population. We're really just at the beginning of that technology. Think of this as like 1980 for the PC, or 1990 for the internet. I think it's pretty clear that most of the people in the world are going to have some device that they're going to wear or carry 10, 20 years from now. And they're going to carry it, they're going to wear it parts of their lives, parts of the world that communication and computation didn't reach before. We're already seeing the beginnings of some changes in the access to information that people never had access to before. And I hasten to add that this is not some magical cure for the problems of poverty, but there's a lot of talk about the digital divide. We're beginning to see that access to mobile phones and to SMS is giving some people advantages that only the wealthier classes had before. The Grameen Bank gives microloans for women to have one mobile phone in the village in Bangladesh. It's a nice little business for that one woman. It also means that everybody else in that village has access to information about the spot labor market. So if there's work for 2 laborers and hours walk away, some people may be able to feed their children who weren't able to do so before. You can get an SMS message offshore that will tell you which port already has fish, and you're probably not going to get a good price for your catch. Which port you're probably going to be able to sell your catch and again feed your kids. So I think what that means, for better and for worse, is that the participants in this emerging regime is going to be much, much larger than the participants in the PC and the internet world. Not only in the way it affects their lives, but in the way they affect the medium. And I think that that's another characteristic of the PC and the internet revolutions that we need to keep in mind, which is that the Defense Department, U.S. Defense Department, and large companies like the telephone operators and like IBM certainly were responsible for creating the earliest technologies, but neither the PC nor the internet were created by those institutions. They were both created by the users, by millions of users, some of whom did it for fun, some of whom did it for public good, and some of whom did it for wealth. We know of Bill Gates today as the wealthy, powerful leader of Microsoft. He was a 19-year-old college dropout when he started Microsoft, and in fact, around the same time, the people who started Apple Computer were also 19 years old. Tim Berners-Lee did not have to ask permission from anyone. He didn't have to rewire the network in order to create the web. The web was in fact created by millions of people putting up websites. I think that there's a critical uncertainty about this emerging technology, about whether, again, we will see millions of users creating this medium or whether that will be limited. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. And I know that Cory Doctorow is going to talk about that a great deal more. So, although I think there are some things we can predict, one critical uncertainty is whether this is going to be a technology regime that's driven by users who shape the technology to our ends, or whether we will be passive consumers of what is sold to us by existing enterprises. Well, I think another thing that we have to keep in mind that we learned from what happened with the PC and what happened with the internet is that Moore's law drives quantitative changes in the power of the technologies as more people use them that lead to qualitative changes in how you use them and what you can use them for. We have these laptops that you all have here, devices that some people have in your pockets. Those are thousands of times more powerful and a fraction of the price of the first PCs. I had to get my first bank loan to buy an IBM XT in the early 1980s. It cost about $5,000 US. The processor in that IBM XT, the 8086 processor, you can now get in a chip, 1/5 of a millimeter on the side. It means that if I dropped it, I wouldn't be able to find it easily, for less than 25 cents. And they're trying to drive that down to less than a penny. So I think that whatever else we can safely predict, we can safely predict that 10 or 15 or 20 years from now, billions of people are going to be walking around carrying or wearing devices that are thousands of times more powerful than today's PCs, probably linked at speeds much greater than what we consider broadband today. What are the unique characteristics of this emerging medium? That was what really drove me to investigate. I think you can make a simple generalization that the unique characteristic of the PC is the unique characteristic of the computer itself, that it's a universal machine. It's whatever you can program it to be. So it's a word processor, and it's a communicator, or you can use it for design, or you can use it to do calculations. As long as somebody can program it, then that PC becomes something else. And of course, it's very difficult to foresee in 1980 what we have today with things like Photoshop or desktop video. It would have been surprising to people to think about that. I think the unique characteristic of the internet, which I wrote about in my previous book more than 10 years ago, is the many-to-many characteristic of the medium. That every node, every computer connected to the internet became a printing press, a broadcasting station, a marketplace, a place of assembly. We're, I think, are all accustomed to that now. Probably some of you are blogging this, and somebody on the other side of the world is learning about what I'm saying here today, and we pretty much take that for granted. So what's the unique characteristic of this medium that merges the PC, the internet, and the telephone? And I think going back to those teenagers and those Philippine citizens, it has to do with collective action. So I started looking around for obvious examples of ways in which people were using the internet for collective action. And it doesn't take a lot of thinking to see a lot of examples. The web itself. No government or corporation could set out to create the web and expect to have it done anytime in this century. But if you give millions of people the power to put up their websites and link to other websites, you get 4 billion pages in 2,000 days. And that ability of individuals to choose what they want to do and to build links, of course, aggregates up into something that you can't really see from the individual website. So now we've got search engines. Google is very fantastically effective and popular because it uses the decisions of millions of people and the billions of links that they make to determine what's useful. Now, I would say that nobody or extremely few people are thinking, I'm going to make search engines more effective when they are putting a web page together. They're simply thinking, what are the links I could use on my web page that are going to be most useful for my readers? But in the aggregate, those decisions add up to something that has an emergent value. So when I say collective action, I don't necessarily mean that people are aware that they are doing something together that's creating a value for all of them. They're acting in their self-interest. They're doing it in a way that adds up. Another example, which I think has a lot of implications that are difficult to foresee today, is what's known as distributed computation. SETI at home, probably some of you participate in that. SETI is the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. There's a radio telescope in Puerto Rico that sucks down massive amounts of radio signals from outer space, turns that into digital form. The idea is to look through those signals to see whether maybe there are messages from civilizations far away. Now, this is not something that taxpayers are likely to pay for, but they ask for volunteers, and somewhere between 2 and 3 million people have volunteered so far to use their PCs to help with this. So if you participate, you download a program from SETI at home, and when you're not using your PC, the program wakes up like a screensaver, downloads a chunk of this data from outer space, runs a pattern recognition algorithm on it, and then sends the results back to SETI headquarters. Now, to me, what's interesting about this is not so much looking for life in outer space, but the fact that those 2 to 3 million volunteers have amassed around 30 teraflops of computing power. That's 30 trillion operations per second. That's far more computing power than was available in the world not too many years ago. Now, if you do a search on distributed computation, you'll find that it's not just looking for little green men in outer space. There's folding.stanford.edu, has to do with protein folding. Biomedical researchers trying to find medicines for cancer, trying to understand the immune system, trying to find vaccines or medicines for AIDS, are very interested in the way proteins fold, the way they configure themselves in space, particularly the proteins that are found on the surface of cells. Well, it turns out that proteins are very complex molecular structures. The shapes they take are very complex, and the computations required in order to try to search for all of the possible combinations in which proteins can fold is so computationally intensive that no single biomedical researcher can really do very much, can't really make a dent in the possibility space there. However, again, like SETI at Home, they've asked for volunteers, and they have been able to do thousands of years worth of mainframe computer research simply by having volunteers contribute their PCs to the effort. You'll see that there are people who are trying to predict the weather. People are cracking cryptography algorithms or gaining prizes that are awarded by the companies that make encryption. And of course, encryption is not just important for national security, but it's the basis of online commerce. And a lot of that encryption is based on the computational intractability of certain algorithms. It turns out if you get enough people together, they're not intractable. I'm certain that there are scientific and mathematical discoveries that are going to be made. There's going to be forms of research that are going to be conducted that we really can't dream of today. When, again, you think of 10 or 20 years from now and we have billions of people walking around carrying or wearing devices thousands of times more powerful than these PCs, linked at very high speeds, kind of computations that they can put together, I think adds up to something that's as different as doing science with computers is from doing science before computers. Now, another example of collective action is eBay. Now, economists will tell you that eBay is a marketplace that should not really exist because when you have a buyer and a seller who are separated in space, maybe hundreds of miles or thousands of miles apart, have never met before, are probably not going to have a transaction again, probably will never meet, then each one of them, the person who has something to sell, the person who has the money to pay for it, each of them take the risk of being cheated if they move first. And that's what economists call the classic prisoner's dilemma. They're frozen in that dilemma, and a market doesn't exist. But in fact, that market does exist, several $billion worth a year, because if you want to buy something from a seller, you can go and check and see what previous buyers have had to say about that seller's track record, about their reputation. And in fact, the reputation of a seller is worth a lot of money. If you have a lot of endorsements from people who bought things from you successfully before, you can put a power seller icon up on your page. That means that if you sell some good, you can charge more for it, significantly more for it, than someone who sells exactly the same good, but they just started selling it today and they don't have a reputation built up. I think another critical uncertainty about the future of the mobile media is whether those reputation systems are going to generalize and whether we're going to be able to use them as we move around in the world. Now, another characteristic of the devices we carry is that they already know where we are by a number of different means. And of course, there's some privacy implications to that. The state right now are the ones who can surveil your location, and maybe in the future that your neighbors or people who want to sell you something can surveil your location. If you add that location awareness of the devices to the possibility of reputation systems, I think an entire kind of social use of technology becomes possible. And here we're becoming, I think, pretty speculative. This might not happen at all. But 10 years ago, when I was talking about virtual communities, quite often I would talk to audiences who would think it was a little strange, or more than a little strange, when I said that if I'm interested in something, I can find someone I've never met before who shares that interest, maybe on the other side of the world, who I communicate with online. And in fact, I've got a lot of those correspondents who share a lot of different interests all over the world. I think we take that for granted now, and I would bet that all of you have some kind of connection like that. And millions of people now know that if you have a disease or you're a caregiver for someone with a disease, if you've got a hobby, you're looking for a spare part for a rare old automobile, you're trying to figure out how to configure a computer network, any one of hundreds of thousands of subjects, you can find someone out there who shares that interest and who will give you some information, who you may in fact end up meeting, becoming a friend. I think it's entirely possible that that characteristic of the internet, of connecting people who don't know each other but who share an interest, could extend to the mobile space. In some parts of the world, they're already experimenting with this. You can say to your telephone, I'm leaving from where I am now, and I'm going to my office, my factory, my school. I'm going to be driving. Who, along my route, is looking for a ride exactly where I'm going right now, and is guaranteed to be trustworthy or even interesting by someone I know? I suspect that if these services emerge, it will be around that. There's an enormous economic incentive to ride sharing. Big companies in Seattle, Boeing, has 70,000 people going to that factory. They pay a lot of money to the city of Seattle for their use of the roads and the transit systems there. If they can encourage ride sharing among people there, then that's a big economic incentive. But of course, we're surrounded by strangers. Wherever we go, we're the crowd. Some of those people may have something in common, and we don't know who they are, and we don't know how far to trust them. I'm going to be in the airport for the next 3 hours. There's someone in this airport from my hometown, or works for my company, or went to my college. Are there people around me on the street who live nearby, might be interested in buying the bicycle I have for sale, interested in a date on Saturday night? All of the things that people do socially online, will we be able to do with our mobile devices? Let me talk about this notion of collective action for a moment, because I'm giving you some kind of perhaps superficial examples, but I think if you look over the long run, whenever a new technology enables people to organize collective action with people they weren't able to organize before, in places and at rates they weren't able to organize before, and at scales they weren't able to organize before, then civilizations change. Humans were very much physically like we are today for a long time, but they lived in small family groups, hunting, fishing, gathering whatever roots and berries they could find, moving from one hunting ground, fishing ground to another. for much longer than we've been settled. At some point, we know just from the fossil record, groups of humans began to organize rather larger groups who were necessarily not direct relatives in order to hunt larger mammals. They're very, very successful at that. In North America, within a few thousand years of the arrival of humans on that continent, all of the large mammals were hunted to extinction. Now, it's not easy or safe to hunt a woolly mammoth. It's dangerous and it's complicated. It requires some kind of coordination. We don't know exactly how that coordination was done. We know that some people got together and started fires and drove animals off cliffs. Others hunted in groups with spears. But we can infer that one interesting thing happened, which was that suddenly a new form of wealth was created. Humans don't store protein. We need to obtain protein on a regular basis. And suddenly, hunters were able to bring back more meat, more protein than the hunters or their families were able to consume before that meat was spoiled. A surplus. What happened? We have no idea what happened. Did the people who partook of that wealth but weren't involved in hunting it owe something to the people who gained it? Do they have to figure out some kind of accounting system? We don't really know. But I suspect that was really an important beginning of complex social arrangements around collective action. Again, when settled agriculture started happening, people started organizing big irrigation projects. They were able to grow enough food to support a population which people could specialize. Not everyone had to spend their time hunting for food. As a result of that, the first giant empires arose. And in order to keep track of who owed taxes and who worked and who could get some of the grain from the granary, those empires employed people who created writing systems. And alphabetic writing was really confined to the elites who were chosen by the empires for thousands of years. Not very long ago, the printing press, 500–600 years ago, made this power of transmitting knowledge across time and space available to a vastly larger population. Literate populations emerged in Europe really within decades of the availability of print. And literate populations began to perform collective actions to create institutions that had not existed before. So we began to see overthrow of monarchies and creation of constitutional democracies. We began to see the emergence of science as a kind of organized collective knowledge gathering. It's not accurate to make a causal relationship. The printing press didn't cause democracy or science, but printing press enabled literate populations. And you really can't have a population begin to think of governing itself unless they are able to understand and communicate and debate the issues that a population needs to know in order to govern themselves. In regard to science, it used to depend on a genius like an Aristotle emerging. Now the system became much more collective, widespread. If you could read and write and you knew the rules, you could make observations, you could perform experiments, you could write about that, you could report about that, and collectively that added up. A lot of the need for libraries had to come from the explosion of knowledge that was created in that way. So I think that what we're seeing with the changes from the internet are just really the beginning of people inventing new forms of collective action, and that when that ability to contact people who share an interest, of course in the Philippines it was interest in what was going on with the Estrada regime, but it may be all kinds of interests, that new forms of collective action emerge. Of course, since I wrote the book, we've seen a lot of political manifestations of people using SMS and mobile telephones and internet forms of collective action. In Spain, March 11th, terrorist attacks. The government broadcast that the explosions were probably caused by the Basque separatists. Almost immediately, text messages began circulating that said, government is lying to us, pass it on. And in fact, they organized demonstrations and brought down that government. Another form of collective action, blogging. I bet you a lot of you are already familiar with that. In Korea, there's a group blog that's a form of news media called Oh My News. It does have professional reporters and editors. Also has 26,000 citizen reporters, some of whom report from their telephones, send in pictures from their telephones. They vote on which stories make the top page. In the election for the presidency of Korea, I guess about a year and a half ago, the candidate that was favored by the Oh My News readers, and they were for the most part the younger cyber generation in Korea, that candidate was losing in the polls, and in fact, during the election itself, during the exit polls, was shown to be behind. Oh My News put out a call saying, get your friends to go out and vote right now. Over 1 million emails were sent out within a couple of hours, an uncounted number of SMS messages. And in fact, they tipped that election, and President Roh granted his first interviews not to the traditional and powerful Korean media, but to Oh My News. We saw the emergence of the Howard Dean candidacy in the USA, candidate who was not anointed by the political leadership, being chosen really by supporters. They put up a website that enabled all of the supporters to blog and contribute money. In small contributions, they were contributing approximately $50,000 an hour. You know, although the US election was won by the very traditional political campaign, the opposition, John Kerry, raised more money, small contributions online, than Al Gore raised altogether before. The ability to raise money for political campaigns in the US and elsewhere has shifted from going to the $1,000 a plate dinners and the large donors to appealing to millions of people who can click and send you a small amount of money. Enabling your supporters to have their own blogs online can elevate a candidate who's totally obscure to national prominence. I think it's foolish to extrapolate from the results today and predict what's going to happen tomorrow. I'm quite certain that not all demonstrations are going to be peaceful or democratic. There are fascist mobs, there are riots that can be summoned by these means. In fact, about a year and a half ago in Nigeria, there was unrest around the Miss World pageant. People were summoned to what ended up being riots through SMS messages. So not every smart mob is a wise mob. Not all collective action is beneficial collective action. Not every group of people who are able to cooperate better because of a new technology have constructive ends in mind. Terrorists, criminals, authoritarian governments, spammers, your neighbor or your ex-spouse who may have a grudge against you, they now have a lot of power that they didn't have before as well. And of course, this has been true of every communication technology. I want to talk about just one more aspect of the world that we're moving into, and this one is one that's, I think, a little bit less familiar to us who carry telephones and use PCs, a little bit more futuristic, but when I say future, I'm talking really about 10 or 15 years. And that's what's called pervasive computing or ubiquitous computing. The notion that the cost of microchips is dropped to the point where they're going to be embedded in manufactured objects, really by the trillions. I talked about the 8086 processor that's now very tiny, very inexpensive. Sensor networks that take these processors, connect them with a sensor. It can sense human presence, it can sense an electronic transaction, it can sense microwaves or chemicals. You can put them in a bandage and they can sense infections, or they can sense changes in the blood chemistry, they can sense pollution in the air, they can sense biochemical attacks. These tiny sensors with radio circuits that talk to each other form ad hoc networks, are formed by distributing trillions of these devices. They're calling it smart dust now. More mundanely, the barcodes that enable companies to track their supply chain, that make most of the manufacturing and distribution that we're accustomed to today possible, are going to be translated into these RFID tags that the Walmarts and Procter & Gamble's of the world are now ramping up to produce by the billions and then the trillions. You know, if you look around, probably in your pocket or your backpack, or on the table, you've got a soft drink or something. Practically everything has one of these barcodes on them. And barcodes really have had an enormous impact on the world. It's not necessarily visible, but warehouses are gone. Automobiles are manufactured just in time, with all of the parts that are required being sent to them as they're needed. These huge stores, the big box stores, those really have to do with being able to track everything all along the way. Probably everyone here has had the experience of sending a package by courier and then going online to find out where it is, because barcode readers have tracked it every step of the way. I'm mentioning this because this is sort of today's version of what's going to be embedded in these objects. Of course, an RFID tag can hold millions of times more information than a barcode can, and you can write information to it in a way that you can't. I think that there's a potential for collective action here, and I'm just going to briefly tell you about something I've seen recently that can kind of give you a picture of what might be possible. A friend of mine has been experimenting, and I think that his experiments are significant because he works for Microsoft. He's taken a handheld device, iPad, a handheld computer with wireless connection, and he's installed some software on it that enables the camera to be a barcode reader. And he's connected that to a bit of code that goes to the internet and searches. Well, barcodes store information that's provided by the manufacturer that's in a universal product code database. And when you go to the supermarket and that's scanned, that can be connected to that database. So I held this device in my hand and I said, well, that's kind of interesting. What the heck are you going to do with something like that? And he said, well, just give it a try. So I went into his kitchen, I scanned. The first object I saw was a box of prunes, dried plums, cardboard box, a little barcode on it. And that returned a number of different fields of information that were available from this database. And one of them was the vendor. It's called the Sun Diamond Growers Cooperative. It sounded to me like some hippies in California who organically grew prunes and got together to sell them. I clicked the link to Google, and interestingly enough, the top link that came up was the US versus Sun Diamond. It was a Supreme Court case about Sun Diamond's attempts to bribe legislators. The second link was from an organization called Court Watch, and the headline was "Bromine Barons Subvert Democratic Process." Well, it turns out that Sun Diamond is about $1 billion a year, and they are the world's largest contributors to lobbying against controls on the chemical methyl bromide. Whatever that means, that's information that you're not likely to find on the label of books or prunes. Labels are the site of a lot of political conflict. It took many years and actually pitched battles to get labels in clothing. Labels enable consumers to know things and to organize collective action or not organize collective action. So I thought, well, gee, that's kind of interesting, perhaps anomalous. I went and I scanned the second thing that I found, which is Kellogg's Cracklin Oat brand. Cracklin without a G. And it turns out that one of the top links was the U.S. Food and Drug Administration withdraws cereal from market for unlabeled egg and dairy content. If you're allergic to egg or dairy and you ate that, you could have died. It's possible, using the devices we carry, to not only gain information about the objects and places around us, but to make collective decisions about that. What does my church or labor union or political party or political action group say about this product? Let me see the webcam in the factory in Pakistan where 11-year-olds make these shoes. It's possible that the enormous power of consumption, just the everyday purchases you make, could tip to consumers and cause a kind of political power much greater than the kind of political power we're aware of today. Are individuals who carry the devices around going to have the ability to find out that information? Are they going to have the ability to write information that's associated with places and objects? That's unclear. You can also associate information with places. Slovenia today, I was there about 6 months ago, they've got 3G working. You can actually ask your phone, where's the nearest Chinese restaurant and what do people say about it on the internet? The ability for people to leave messages about places as well as things is, again, another opening to potential collective action that the devices we carry make possible. And now we are seeing the operators are very interested in turning telephones into wallets and enabling people to make purchases. And in a few parts of the world today, probably here, you can buy a ticket via your telephone and get a barcode that's downloaded, and when you go to the ticket booth, you show them the telephone and they scan that barcode. In Japan and in Germany, you can get on a bus or a train, you can use your telephone. The devices that we carry are no longer just for making voice conversations, they are a connection to this whole world of information. I think increasingly, the digital divide is not going to be between people who can afford to have access to the hardware or even to pay for the service, but between those who know how to use them to their advantage, who know how to access collective action or virtual communities or summon their social networks, and those who don't. So the haves and have-nots are now perhaps less important than the knows and know-nots. And I think that in this world of increasingly complex, bewildering information, the traditional role of the librarian to help in wayfinding has a place. I don't know what that place is, but I think whatever the fate of books and physical repositories for them, the necessity to have some help in finding our way around this world in order to have the knowledge that gives us the power to organize collective action, participate in collective action, is going to require somebody to help. As I said at the beginning, there's an uncertainty about this future, and the uncertainty is whether we're going to have as much to say about this emerging medium as we did with the PC and the internet. Cory Doctorow, those of you who stick around for him will find he's a very compelling speaker about this subject. He's going to tell you more about the fact that the motion picture industry, the recording industry, the big companies that own not only communications but content are very interested in restricting our ability to shape the media we use. The users of the PC and the internet were active users who shaped those media, who created enterprises, now some of them gigantic enterprises, created millions of small enterprises, created an entire economy, created the web, may be transformed into passive consumers whose only choice really is which brand to buy. The way it used to be when there were only a couple of television channels and only one telephone network. The Digital Millennium Copyright Act, the extension of copyright law at the expense of what used to be the public domain, the regulation of the electromagnetic spectrum according not to what's now possible with new kinds of devices, but according to the incumbents who've paid a lot of money to governments for slices of the spectrum. What's being called trusted computing, that's baking controls into the operating systems and the chips themselves. These are really all about, not about theft, but about control. They're about whether individuals will be able to innovate in the future, or whether you're going to have to be an employee of Sony or Disney in order to invent something like the web or like Microsoft in the future. So I think, well, Cory will talk about it. When he's not here, I always encourage people to go to EFF.org to find out more information about this. What we know matters. These legal battles originating in the US, but spreading throughout the world through the World Intellectual Property Organization. They're not all settled yet. We've not seen this situation before. Joseph Schumpeter wrote about creative destruction. Capitalism is supposed to be about new products, new services, new technologies, destroy old ones that weren't as effective, weren't as efficient, weren't as widespread. We did not see the buggy whip manufacturers hold the automobile back. We did not see the telegraph companies prevent the telephone. We did not, in those days, see the kinds of concentrations of worldwide wealth and power in collusion with political regimes, baking into law restrictions on what new technologies can be. It might be that the kind of innovation that's brought the changes for better and worse that have happened in the past is simply not going to happen in the future. It may in fact be a good thing to slow innovation down, but a much smaller number of people are going to profit from it and have profited from the rate of innovation that's happened in the past. So I'd like to spend the remaining half hour here in discussion and open the floor to questions. I know that there's a lot that I left out, and a lot that I left out have to do with the darker sides of what I'm talking about. Surveillance, not just by the state, but by people who want to sell you things, or by your neighbors who want to spy on you. The kind of world in which you don't really know which objects are paying attention to you or not. I think there are a lot of questions to ask about the downsides here. And I think that there are other opportunities I haven't discussed. So I'm open the floor to questions.